examples of this regression type. If we take Newton, he had within his classical mechanics two interesting problems which he wanted to solve by hypothesis that maybe God created something or had influence on something. One problem is that if you have a Newtonian view of the solar system, you have to postulate that if planets stay in their orbits, they have to have exactly the right speed, because when the speed is a little bit too high, they might fly into the universe, and if the speed is a little bit too low, they might collapse into the sun, so there is a problem. And Darwin thought that he might solve this problem by saying that God had given the planets exactly the right speed. And another problem in Newtonian celestial mechanics was that because of the gravitational influence of planets on each other, there was a collapse of the system. The system was unstable according to Newton, and he thought that God might correct by times the course of the planets in order to avoid this instability. Now, if we go a little bit further in the history of physics and we go to Pierre Laplace, he corrected Newton in this point, and he showed that neither the problem of instability is as serious as Newton thought, and he also explained why the planets have the right speed, because he proposed, like Immanuel Kant did, a theory of the history of the universe which explained that all the planets who had too high a speed, they flew into the universe. All the planets who had not enough speed, they collapsed into the sun, and the remaining planets are just those planets that had the right speed to stay in their orbits. So that's one example of a degenerating research program. And of course another example is Darwin. Before Darwin, many people thought that the first individuals of a species were created by God. This was called the theory of special creation, and Darwin showed in 1859 very clearly that his theory was superior. So my first advice is, don't go for this option where theism, so the theory that God exists, should be supported by evidence, because it's a losing game. You might have a kind of generalization from all these examples, and you might say that all the other problems that physicists might like to explain by the hypothesis of God, such as fine-tuning, will maybe in the end be solved by physics, and the physical theories are always much better than the theological theory. So that's my first advice. Don't go for this option at all. But that's of course not yet a defense of the thesis, so let me go into that. There are some physicists who think that there are interesting facts about the physical system we now have and about the universe, interesting facts that can only be explained by the divine hypotheses. And I will mention only so-called facts of fine-tuning. Now, I won't go into the physical details because that's very complicated, but the general idea is that if you look at the present-day laws of physics and theories, there are many constants in these laws and in these theories which cannot be explained theoretically. They are just brute facts, it seems. And physicists have shown, well, there's a lot to say about this, but suppose they have shown that these constants have to be in quite narrow ranges if the universe could develop or must develop or could develop into a universe, for instance, with life. So you need your constants in your laws, and there are many examples of this, in quite specific ranges, because otherwise, for instance, the universe would collapse very shortly after the Big Bang, or life would not develop, and so on and so on. There are many examples of this. And the argument that Christian physicists then put forward is that given the hypothesis of God, this fine-tuning of the universe is quite probable, but given the hypothesis of chance, so if you think it's just a brute fact, it's chance that this is the case, the fine-tuning of the universe would be very improbable, and that means that the effects of fine-tuning are good evidence for the hypothesis of God, and they plead against the hypothesis of a chance matter. Now, it's interesting to study the logic of such an argument, and I have put on the handout under 4A, sorry, the logic of such an argument. And we call this in philosophy, we call this the principle of likelihood. So if a certain hypothesis makes a certain piece of evidence more likely than another hypothesis, then that evidence favors the first hypothesis in relation to the second hypothesis, and you find the precise notation on the handout. Now, my question to you would be, is this a good type of argument? Does it really show something? So fine-tuning would confirm, according to this argument, fine-tuning would confirm the gold hypothesis better than the chance hypothesis. Is that a good argument? Now, logicians very often show for general public, so we don't need interesting formal work here. For general public, you might show why this argument is a very bad argument by giving a so-called logical analogy. And my logical analogy is the following. Suppose that I have a student, she is called Vol Marie, this is on the handout, and she argues that she has a personal god of love called Cupido. And her proof is that every time that she drives to her boyfriend by a motorbike, all the traffic lights go green exactly when she goes to the traffic lights. And she thinks that if Cupido exists, of course these facts are much more probable than if this is a pure chance matter. And she thinks that this is a very good proof that Cupido exists. Now, would you accept that? Well, there are two difficulties, and I will end with these two difficulties. One difficulty is that, according to most of us, the prior probability that Cupido exists is very, very low, for all kinds of reasons. So, even if you have confirming evidence, if the prior probability is very, very low, the evidence doesn't mean anything, or not much. Now, my claim would be that this is the same for the traditional definition of the Christian God, who is a mind without a body. Now, we have lots and lots of background knowledge that show that minds without bodies don't exist and probably can't exist. So given our background knowledge from neuroscience, for instance, we think that the existence of God is very, very improbable. So this type of fine-tuning argument doesn't convince me at all. But there is a much more serious point. In order to set up a likelihood argument of the form I sketched, you have to determine what the likelihood is, given the existence of God, that certain empirical phenomena will occur. Now, God is almighty, so he might realize anything he wants. So in order to determine the likelihood that given God something is likely, you have to have independent evidence on the intentions of God. You have somehow to determine what God's intentions are, because otherwise you can't determine the likelihood. Now, most religious people claim, when they are confronted with, for instance, the problem of evil, that God's intentions are unfathomable. We can't know God's intentions at all. Now, if that is true, no possible likelihood argument for the existence of God is possible, and that means that my conclusion is even stronger than the logically very strong thesis that I have to defend. The thesis that I have to defend is only that there is no evidence for the existence of God, but I have now argued that there cannot be any evidence for the existence of God, because you can determine the likelihoods only if you have independent evidence about the intentions of God, and we don't have that type of independent evidence at all, so you can't have any evidence for God's existence. And that's what I was supposed to defend, or even stronger than the thesis that I was supposed to defend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philips. So, there cannot be any evidence for God, he said, well, in a church that isn't used as a church anymore. So maybe he has a point, and maybe he doesn't. Dr. Art Louis from Oxford University likes to take this argument, and he even prepared a presentation to convince us. You like to use the stand, I guess?
I would, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Art Louis.
Set my stopwatch. Great, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me, and to all of you for coming. It's also a pleasure for me to debate Professor Philips. I actually went to a few of his guest lectures he gave last in Trinity Term in Oxford. I found them very interesting. In retrospect, I'm sorry I didn't go to more, because because I would have known more of his arguments in advance. Now, I'll tell you something about myself. I'm a Christian, and I'm a scientist. And to some people, that sounds like I'm telling you that I'm a vegetarian butcher, an oxymoron of some kind. But I hope to tell you tonight that I think that I have pretty rational arguments for believing in God. And I'm not going to speak primarily about the Christian God because the theme is really theism, so I'm going to try to argue towards theism. But obviously, if theism is incorrect, Christianity is incorrect as well. So I have some investment in this argument. Speaking of vegetarian butchers, in Oxford, I have quite a few of my physicist colleagues who are Christian. I'd say at least 15 of the other professors are actively engaged in their churches. And quite a larger number of us get together once a term in a forum to discuss questions of science and faith. In fact, that forum was founded by a man who is now the head of all research for the whole university. Before you worry too much that Oxford will become a hotbed of dangerous theists, I should say that by and large we're quietly getting along with our science, and how, we enjoy ourselves occasionally in discussions about the big questions of life. And in fact, if Professor Philipson comes again, we would very much, I think, enjoy having him present some of these ideas to us. I think almost all of us would agree, my colleagues and I, that we believe for many reasons, but that rational reasons are definitely important. So our faith is definitely undergirded in part by rational arguments. And for the journalists and politicians, I guess both of you in the audience, just a little soundbite, not science or faith, but science and faith, or not faith or rationality, but faith and rationality, or faith-seeking understanding. So I'm very lucky. It's great to discuss these things with colleagues. It's something that I really greatly enjoy. It's also something which is fun, and I hope tonight to say a number of slightly provocative things that will provoke you into thinking. Hopefully these will be things that you enjoy as well. And I say that because one of the things we've known, I say it not entirely flippantly, I also say it somewhat seriously, because one thing we've realized as scientists is that oftentimes it's the curiosity-driven work, it's thinking about things that we think are fun, that generates the best new and interesting ideas. So I guess I really want to stop for the back. That's a translation, okay, great. So another thing I should say before I forget is that I'm quite thankful to this audience. So a few generations ago, for me to be a scientist, I would have been born in a wealthy family, which I wasn't. But nowadays, there's a guild of people who are paid money to do science. In fact, by and large, it's your money, taxpayer money. So I want to say thank you very much. So the question really tonight is a question about evidence for and against God. And the first point I really want to make is that the key difficulty is not the evidence, but how do we weigh the evidence? How should we weigh the evidence? How should we think, really, about these questions? So let me take a step back and ask yourself this question. How did the world come into being? Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, as far as I see it, there's three options. One option is the world has always been. But the more we think about it, the odder that becomes, because that means something was caused by something before that. There's some kind of an infinite regress of causes back into infinity. That's odd. Why can something be infinite? What does it really mean to have an infinite series of causes? The other option is that the world just appeared out of nothing. That somehow seems even odder to me. How does something just appear out of nothing? The third option is that something that was transcendent outside of the world that we know, which contains within itself the reason for its own existence, that is to say, it cannot not exist, created this world. And that, from many views, is also an odd suggestion. So really, what I want to argue is that all the options are completely different from my day-to-day experience. And given that all the options are completely different from our day-to-day experience, it may mean that the way we think about these things may sometimes be different as well. This is why I want to have a colleague, Richard Dawkins in Oxford, who has a wonderful way with words, so I'll quote him. If you want to believe in teapots, unicorns, or tooth fairies, Thor or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say why you believe in it. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. We, who are atheists, are also atheists, ateapotists, and a-unicornists. But we don't bother having to say so. Now,